Eleanor Whitfield stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom as laughter rippled around her like cold water. Lady Cassandra Pemberton had just spoken the words loud enough for every guest to hear, and now those words hung in the air, impossible to take back. "No gentleman will ever want you, Miss Whitfield. Not with that tongue of yours. Not with those opinions you refuse to keep to yourself." The candles above the dance floor flickered as if even the flames were embarrassed for her. Eleanor felt her face grow hot, but she did not look away. She had learned long ago that looking away only invited more cruelty. Instead, she lifted her chin and let her eyes meet Cassandra's, steady and unblinking, even as her heart pounded so hard she feared the whole room could hear it. "Perhaps," Eleanor said quietly, "a man who cannot bear an honest woman was never worth wanting in the first place." A few gasps rose from the nearby guests. Someone tittered behind a fan. Cassandra's smile thinned, but she recovered quickly, tossing her golden curls and turning to the circle of admirers who always seemed to surround her like moths around a candle. "How delightfully bold," Cassandra said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Bold enough to frighten away every eligible man in London, it seems." The circle laughed again, and Eleanor felt the sting deepen, though she refused to let it show. She had come to this ball at her mother's insistence, wearing a dress that had been mended twice at the hem because there was no money for a new one. She had come hoping, foolishly perhaps, that tonight might be different, that someone might look past her plain gown and her sharp tongue and see something worth knowing. Instead, she had become the evening's entertainment. Eleanor turned and walked toward the edge of the room, her back straight, her steps unhurried, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her run. She found a quiet corner near a tall window, where the noise of the party grew distant, and pressed her gloved hand against the cool glass to steady herself. It was there in that corner that she felt eyes upon her. She turned, expecting another mocking face, another whispered joke waiting to be delivered. Instead, she found a stranger watching her from across the room, half hidden in shadow near a marble column. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes far less ornamented than the other gentlemen present, and he was not laughing. His expression was unreadable, though something in his gaze felt different from the curious, cruel stare she had grown used to that evening. It felt like he was actually seeing her, rather than the scene that had just unfolded around her. Eleanor held his gaze for a moment longer than was proper, then looked away, embarrassed by her own boldness. When she glanced back, he was gone. She told herself it did not matter. Strangers at balls meant nothing. She had more pressing concerns waiting for her at home: her father's mounting debts, her mother's constant worry, her younger sister Charlotte's hopeful questions about whether tonight had gone well. Eleanor did not know how she would answer those questions. She certainly could not tell the truth. The carriage ride home was silent except for the rattle of wheels against cobblestone. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, replaying Cassandra's words over and over, each repetition cutting a little deeper than the last. She was 23 years old, unmarried, and now, thanks to tonight, thoroughly humiliated in front of half of fashionable society. Word would spread by morning. It always did. When she arrived home, her mother was waiting in the drawing room, her needlework abandoned in her lap, her face lined with the particular worry that came from raising two daughters with very little money, and even less hope of an advantageous match. "Well?" her mother asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "It was a lovely evening," Eleanor said, which was not quite a lie and not quite the truth either. Her mother studied her for a long moment, then sighed and returned to her needlework. "Your father received another letter today, from the bank." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "How bad?" "Bad enough that he has been in his study since supper, and has not come out." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding without needing further explanation. The Whitfield family had once held a respectable position among the gentry, but poor investments and worse luck had steadily eroded their fortune over the past several years. Now they clung to appearances they could barely afford, hoping that one of their daughters might marry well enough to save them all. It was, Eleanor thought bitterly, Rather difficult to marry well when an entire ballroom had just watched you be declared unwantable. She excused herself and climbed the stairs to her small bedroom, where Charlotte was waiting, still awake despite the late hour, her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes bright with hope. "Tell me everything," Charlotte said, patting the space beside her on the bed. "Did anyone ask you to dance? Was Lord Pemberton there?" "I heard he's looking for a wife." Elinor sat down heavily and removed her gloves, buying herself a moment before she had to answer. "It was not the evening I hoped for." Charlotte's smile faded. "What happened?" Elinor considered lying, sparing her sister the details, but Charlotte would hear the story eventually, likely exaggerated and twisted by the time it reached her through servants' gossip. Better she hear it plainly now, from someone who loved her. "Lady Cassandra decided to make an example of me," Elinor said, "in front of everyone." "Oh, Elinor," Charlotte's hand found hers and squeezed it. "That woman is cruel. Everyone says so, though no one dares say it to her face." "It does not matter what everyone says. What matters is what everyone believes, and by morning all of London will believe I am unfit for marriage." "You are not unfit," Charlotte said firmly. "You are the cleverest, kindest person I know. Any man who cannot see that does not deserve you." Elinor smiled faintly, grateful for her sister's loyalty, though she knew such words offered little comfort against the reality of their situation. A family in debt could not afford daughters who frightened away suitors with their opinions. She thought again, unbidden, of the stranger by the window, the way he had watched her without judgment, without mockery. She wondered who he was, and why his gaze had lingered in her memory, long after everyone else's cruelty had already begun to fade into the familiar ache of disappointment. She did not know that night that the stranger's name was Julian Hartley, and that he was the Duke of Ashbourne, a man who had spent the evening avoiding the very society that had just humiliated her, precisely because he found its cruelty exhausting. She did not know that he had left the ball early, troubled by what he had witnessed, unable to stop thinking about the woman who had refused to cry in front of a room full of people who wanted nothing more than to see her break. The next morning arrived gray and damp, matching Elinor's mood entirely. She woke early, as was her habit, and made her way to the kitchen before the rest of the household had stirred, seeking the quiet comfort of routine. She was measuring flour for the morning bread when her father entered, his face pale and his eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. "Elinor," he said, his voice heavier than usual, "I must speak with you." She set down the flour and turned to face him, already sensing what was coming. "There is a proposal," her father said carefully, "from Henry Colton. His father owns 3 shipping vessels and a warehouse near the docks. It is not a grand match, but it is a secure one. He has expressed interest in you specifically, despite last night's events." Elinor felt something cold settle in her chest. Henry Colton was pleasant enough, she supposed, though their few conversations had left her feeling as though she were speaking to a wall rather than a person. He showed little interest in books, in ideas, in anything beyond the price of goods and the movement of ships. He wanted a wife who would manage his household quietly and agree with whatever he said. "Father, I have barely spoken 2 words to Mr. Colton." "You do not need to speak many words to him, Elinor. You need to marry him or someone like him before our circumstances become impossible to hide any longer." Her father's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Elinor saw, for the first time, just how frightened he truly was. "How much time do I have to consider it?" "Not much," he admitted. "The bank has given us until the end of the season to settle what we owe or we lose the house." Elinor nodded, though her chest felt tight with a dread she could not fully name. She had always imagined that when she married, it would be to someone who valued her mind as much as her manner, someone who would not wince when she spoke plainly. She was beginning to understand that such a match might exist only in her imagination. "I will consider it," she said finally, because there was little else she could say. Her father nodded, relief and guilt mingling in his expression, and left her alone in the kitchen with her half-measured flour and her rapidly unraveling hopes for the future. Later that day, restless and needing air, Elinor asked the family's aging coachman, Peter, to drive her to visit her aunt in the countryside. A journey of several hours that would at least remove her from London's judgmental gaze for a while. The sky had grown heavier since morning, dark clouds rolling in from the west, and Peter warned her they might not make it back before the weather turned. "I do not mind the rain," Elinor told him, and meant it. Rain, at least, was honest. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. They set out shortly after noon, the carriage wheels creaking over the uneven country road, hedgerows blurring past the window as Elinor watched the darkening sky with something close to relief. Anything felt better than sitting in the drawing room, waiting for her father to ask again about Henry Colton. They were perhaps 2 hours into the journey when the storm finally broke, rain hammering against the carriage roof with sudden violence. Peter called out something about the road turning to mud, and moments later, Elinor felt the carriage lurch and shudder before grinding to a complete stop. One wheel sunk deep into the soft earth at the road's edge. "We're stuck fast, miss," Peter called through the rain. "I'll need to see about freeing the wheel, but it may take some time." Elinor peered out at the darkening road, the rain falling in relentless sheets, and felt, for the first time all day, something other than dread. There was a strange comfort in the storm's honesty, in its refusal to care whether she was fashionable or wanted or clever enough to please a room full of strangers. The rain simply fell, as it always did, indifferent and true. She had no way of knowing that further down that same road, another traveler had also been caught by the storm, and that fate, having already introduced them once across a crowded ballroom, was about to bring them together again in far quieter, far more honest circumstances. Julian Hartley had left the ball early the night before, unable to shake the image of Elinor Whitfield standing perfectly still while an entire room laughed at her expense. He was the Duke of Ashbourne, a title he had inherited far too young, at 26, when his father's sudden illness had taken him within a single winter. Since then, Julian had grown skilled at avoiding the very society his position demanded he attend. Balls, dinners, endless introductions to eligible young women paraded before him like goods at a market. All of it exhausted him in a way he rarely admitted aloud. He had gone to the ball only because his sister Louisa had insisted, arguing that a duke could not hide in his townhouse forever, no matter how much he might wish to. He had planned to stay an hour, perhaps less, and slip away before anyone noticed his absence. Instead, he had found himself transfixed by a woman he had never met, watching the quiet dignity with which she absorbed a cruelty that would have broken many others. He had not approached her. What would he have said? Introducing himself would have only drawn more attention to her humiliation, and something in him had understood, instinctively, that the last thing she needed in that moment was another spectacle. So he had watched from the shadows, and then he had left, and he had spent the entire carriage ride home turning the memory over and over in his mind like a coin he could not stop examining. The next morning he told himself he would forget her. There was estate business to attend to, tenant disputes, a leaking roof at one of his properties, letters from his steward Gareth Sinclair regarding the autumn harvest. He buried himself in ledgers and correspondence, determined to push the strange, persistent thought of her from his mind. It did not work particularly well. By afternoon, restless and unable to concentrate, Julian decided to ride out to inspect a property he owned some hours from London, a modest country house that had fallen into disrepair since his father's death. It was, he told himself, a practical errand, nothing more. He set out on horseback rather than by carriage, preferring the solitude and the fresh air, and it was on that same country road hours later that the storm caught him as well. The rain came suddenly and without mercy, turning the road beneath his horse's hooves to thick, clinging mud. Julian slowed his pace, squinting through the downpour, when he spotted a carriage stopped ahead, tilted awkwardly to one side, its wheel clearly stuck fast in the mud. An older man in a coachman's coat struggled beside it, trying without success to free the wheel alone. Julian dismounted and approached, his boots sinking into the mud with each step. "You'll need more than one pair of hands for that," he called out over the rain. The coachman turned, startled, then relieved. "Much obliged, sir, whoever you are. My mistress is inside, and I fear we'll be stuck here till nightfall without help." Julian moved to the wheel and began examining the problem, and it was then that the carriage door opened, and a woman stepped out into the rain, apparently unwilling to wait passively while others solved her difficulty. She wore no bonnet, having apparently abandoned it inside, and her dark hair was already damp, clinging to her face and neck. She looked entirely unconcerned about her appearance, which struck Julian as remarkable, given how carefully every woman he knew guarded such things. It was Alina Whitfield. He recognized her instantly, though clearly she did not recognize him, her attention fixed entirely on the practical problem of the stuck wheel rather than on the stranger crouched beside it. "If we can find something to place beneath the wheel for traction, it may help," Alina said, already surveying the roadside for loose branches or stones. "I have seen it done before, when our own carriage became stuck near my aunt's property." Julian glanced up at her, surprised by her directness, by the complete absence of the helpless fluttering he had come to expect from women in difficult situations. "A sound idea," he said, "though you may wish to return to the carriage. The rain shows no sign of easing." "I am already thoroughly wet," Alina replied, with a small, wry smile that transformed her entire face. "There seems little point in retreating now." Together, the three of them worked to gather fallen branches and wedge them beneath the sunken wheel, Alina directing the effort with a practical confidence that Julian found himself admiring more with each passing minute. She did not complain about the mud staining her dress or the rain soaking through to her skin. She simply worked, methodically and without fuss, until finally, with Julian and the coachman pushing while Alina guided the horses forward, the wheel lurched free of the mud with a wet, sucking sound. "There," Alina said, breathless and triumphant, wiping rain from her face with the back of her hand. "I told you it would work." "You did," Julian agreed, and found himself smiling, an expression that felt unfamiliar on his face after months of careful, Dukely composure. "Though I confess I am curious how a young lady comes to know so much about freeing stuck carriage wheels." "Necessity," Alina said simply. "Our family's carriage is old and our roads are poor, and I have found that waiting helplessly for rescue rarely improves one's circumstances. It is generally better to solve the problem oneself, where possible." There was something in the way she said it, a slight edge beneath the light tone, that made Julian suspect she was speaking of more than carriage wheels. He found himself wanting to know more, wanting to ask what circumstances had taught her such fierce self-reliance, though propriety and the fact that they had not been properly introduced held him back. "You have my gratitude, sir," Alina said, extending a gloved hand that was, Julian noted, thoroughly soaked and streaked with mud. "Though I fear I do not know your name." Julian hesitated. He could introduce himself properly, could watch her expression shift the way expressions always shifted when people learned he was a duke, the sudden careful politeness, the calculating glint that entered even the kindest eyes. He found in that moment, standing in the rain with mud on his boots and his hair plastered to his forehead, that he did not want that shift to happen. Not yet. "Not with her." "Julian," he said simply, omitting his title entirely. "And you are?" "Alina," she replied, matching his informality without seeming to notice anything unusual about it. "Alina Whitfield." He knew the name already, of course, though he did not say so. Instead, he simply nodded, as though hearing it for the first time. "Well, Alina Whitfield, I would suggest you return to your carriage before you catch your death in this rain. Your wheel should hold now, though I would recommend moving slowly until you reach firmer ground." "And you," Alina asked, studying him with open curiosity, "are you traveling far?" "Far enough," Julian said. "I have business to attend to before nightfall." Alina nodded, though something in her expression suggested she sensed he was being deliberately vague. She did not press him further, which he appreciated, though he could not have said why her restraint mattered so much to him. "Thank you again, Julian," she said, and there was something in the way she spoke his given name, simple and unadorned by any title, that struck him with unexpected force. No one called him simply Julian anymore. Everyone he encountered called him Your Grace or the Duke, or Lord Ashbourne, titles that had slowly, over the years, replaced the person he had once been with the role he was now required to play. "You are entirely welcome, Elinor," he replied, and watched as she climbed back into her carriage, her damp hair and mud-streaked dress somehow making her more striking than any perfectly composed woman he had encountered at last night's ball. As the carriage pulled away, wheels now firm against the muddy road, Julian remained standing in the rain, watching until it disappeared around a bend, unable to shake the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had settled in his chest. He rode the rest of the way to his property in a daze, barely registering the leaking roof or the tenant complaints that awaited him there. His mind kept returning to the same puzzle, turning it over and over. Elinor Whitfield, the woman humiliated at the ball, the woman who had refused to cry, was the very same woman who had just spent an afternoon in the rain, cheerfully wedging branches beneath a carriage wheel rather than waiting helplessly for rescue. He did not know, riding home through the last gray light of the storm, that fate was not finished with the two of them yet, that the coming weeks would test them both in ways neither could yet imagine, and that a single afternoon on a muddy country road had planted a seed that would eventually grow into something neither of them could ignore. Back in London, meanwhile, Lady Cassandra Pemberton had spent the day quite differently, holding court among her circle of friends, retelling the story of Elinor's humiliation, with each retelling growing slightly more exaggerated, slightly more cruel. She did not know, as she laughed and accepted the admiration of her companions, that the very Duke she and every other unmarried woman in London had spent years trying to attract had already, unknowingly, given his attention entirely to the woman she had tried so hard to destroy. Elinor arrived home that evening soaked through and shivering, though her mother's scolding about the dangers of catching a chill could not fully dampen the strange, unexpected lightness she felt. She thought of Julian's easy smile, the way he had worked alongside her without complaint, the way he had spoken her name as though it were simply her name and not a source of shame or scandal. She told herself it meant nothing, that she would likely never see him again, that a chance encounter on a muddy road was hardly the foundation for anything lasting. But that night, lying awake long after Charlotte had fallen asleep beside her, Elinor found herself smiling into the darkness, replaying the afternoon's events with a fondness she could not quite explain, wondering despite herself whether fate might, occasionally, offer second chances to those who had nearly given up hoping for them. 3 weeks passed, and Elinor heard nothing more from the mysterious traveler named Julian, though she found herself thinking of him far more often than she cared to admit. She told herself repeatedly that it was foolish to dwell on a stranger met once in the rain, a man whose full name she did not even know, who had likely already forgotten the afternoon entirely. Yet some nights, as she lay awake listening to Charlotte's steady breathing beside her, she found herself wondering what had become of him, whether he had reached his destination safely, whether he ever thought of the woman who had helped free his path through the mud. Meanwhile, the pressure at home had grown considerably worse. Henry Colton had called twice more, each visit more uncomfortable than the last, his conversation limited entirely to the profitability of his father's shipping ventures and his expectations for how a proper wife ought to manage a household. Elinor found herself counting the minutes until he departed, offering polite responses while her mind wandered elsewhere entirely. "He has asked your father for a definitive answer by month's end," her mother told her one evening, setting down her needlework with the particular heaviness that had become common in their household since the bank's letter arrived. "I know it is not the match you dreamed of, Elinor, but dreams do not pay debts." "I know, mother." Elinor's voice came out quieter than she intended. "I am aware of our circumstances." "Then you understand why this cannot wait much longer." Elinor nodded, though something in her chest tightened painfully at the thought of binding herself for life to a man who showed no interest in anything beyond the practical arrangements of marriage. She thought again, unbidden, of muddy roads and rain-soaked laughter, of a stranger who had called her simply by her name, and looked at her as though her opinions were worth hearing rather than something to be tolerated. She did not know that, across London, That same stranger had spent the past 3 weeks in a state of considerable distraction himself, unable to focus properly on estate matters, finding his attention repeatedly drawn back to memories of a rain-soaked afternoon he could not seem to set aside. Julian had returned to London determined to forget the encounter, reasoning with himself that whatever brief connection he had felt with Eleanor Whitfield had likely been nothing more than the strange intimacy that sometimes arose between strangers thrown together by unusual circumstances. Such feelings rarely survived contact with ordinary life, he told himself. Better to leave the memory as it was, a pleasant afternoon, nothing more. This reasoning lasted precisely until his sister Louisa mentioned, quite by accident during breakfast one morning, the very name that had occupied so much of his thoughts. "Have you heard about the Whitfield girl?" Louisa asked, spreading marmalade across her toast with the casual air of someone sharing ordinary gossip. "Cassandra Pemberton has been telling everyone she is quite unmarriageable, though I have always thought Cassandra's cruelty says far more about her own character than anyone else's." Julian set down his coffee cup with rather more force than he intended. "Whitfield girl. Eleanor Whitfield. Surely you remember the scene at the Ashworth ball. Cassandra humiliated her rather publicly, and now the poor girl's family is apparently pressuring her into marriage with some merchant's son to save themselves from financial ruin. I heard it from Lady Pemberton herself, though of course one must always take her stories with some caution." Julian felt something cold settle in his stomach at the mention of an impending marriage. "Do you know anything more of the circumstances?" Louisa glanced up at him, her expression shifting into something curious. "Why the sudden interest, brother? You have never once cared for society gossip before." "I simply find the situation troubling," Julian said, hoping his voice sounded more casual than he felt. "A woman's future decided entirely by financial necessity, with no regard for her own wishes." "Well, welcome to the entirety of fashionable society," Louisa said dryly, though her sharp eyes remained fixed on her brother's face a moment longer than necessary. "It is rather how most marriages are arranged, Julian, yours included, should you ever bother to consider one." Julian did not respond to this last comment, his mind already occupied elsewhere, turning over the troubling news Louisa had just delivered. Eleanor, forced into marriage with a man she likely did not love, simply to spare her family from financial catastrophe. The thought settled uncomfortably in his chest, refusing to be dismissed no matter how firmly he tried to redirect his attention toward more appropriate concerns. He spent the following days attempting, without much success, to gather further information about Eleanor's circumstances, careful to disguise his interest as idle curiosity rather than anything more significant. Through careful, roundabout inquiries, he learned that the Whitfield family's financial troubles were indeed severe, that a proposal from a merchant's son named Henry Colton was actively under consideration, and that Eleanor's father had given her until the end of the month to provide an answer. Julian told himself repeatedly that this was not his concern. He barely knew Eleanor Whitfield, had spent only a single rain-soaked afternoon in her company, had not even revealed his true identity during their brief acquaintance. He had no claim to involvement in her affairs, no right to interfere in decisions that belonged entirely to her and her family. And yet, he found himself unable to simply let the matter rest. He attended more social events than he had in the previous year combined, hoping for another chance encounter, though propriety made it impossible to seek her out directly without revealing far more about his interest than he was prepared to admit, even to himself. He attended a musical evening hosted by Lady Pemberton herself, gritting his teeth through Cassandra's transparent attempts to capture his attention, his eyes constantly scanning the room for a face he did not find. It was at a garden party some days later, hosted by a family whose name Julian barely registered, that he finally saw her again. Eleanor stood near the edge of the gathering, somewhat apart from the main cluster of guests, engaged in what appeared to be a genuinely interesting conversation with an elderly gentleman about botanical specimens, judging by the animated way she gestured toward a nearby rose bed. She wore a simple green dress, far less elaborate than the gowns worn by most of the other young women present, yet somehow it suited her far better than their finery suited them. Julian found himself crossing the lawn toward her before he had fully decided to do so, his heart beating with an unfamiliar nervousness that felt entirely inappropriate for a man of his position and experience. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and watched her turn, her expression shifting from polite social composure to genuine surprise as she recognized him. "Julian," she said, then caught herself, glancing around as though suddenly remembering they were not alone on a muddy country road but standing in the middle of a fashionable garden party. "I mean, forgive me, I do not believe I know your surname." "Hartley," Julian said, watching her carefully, bracing himself for the shift he had come to expect whenever people learned his full identity. "Though I confess there is more to the name than I revealed during our previous meeting." Elinor's brow furrowed slightly. "More." Before Julian could explain, their conversation was interrupted by their hostess, a cheerful woman who appeared entirely unaware of any tension between them. "Your Grace," she exclaimed, curtsying deeply. "What an honor to have you attend. I did not realize you were acquainted with Miss Whitfield." Julian watched Elinor's face carefully as understanding dawned, watched the color drain slightly from her cheeks before returning in a flush he suspected was equal parts embarrassment and something else he could not quite name. "Your Grace," Elinor repeated slowly, once their hostess had moved on to greet other arriving guests. "You are the Duke of Ashbourne." "I am," Julian admitted. "I did not mean to deceive you, Elinor, You simply allowed me to believe you were an ordinary traveler," Elinor finished, her tone difficult to read. "While I complained, I imagine, about our family's difficulties and gave you every unguarded opinion I possessed, entirely unaware I was speaking to a duke." "You gave me nothing but honesty," Julian said quietly. "It was the most honest conversation I have had in longer than I care to admit. I did not wish to lose that by revealing my title too soon." Elinor studied him for a long moment, and Julian found himself holding his breath, uncertain whether she would forgive the small deception or whether he had, through his own hesitation, ruined whatever fragile connection had begun to form between them on that muddy road. "Well," Elinor said finally, a small, reluctant smile beginning to tug at the corner of her mouth, "I suppose that explains why you seemed entirely unbothered by ruining a fine coat helping free a carriage wheel." Relief flooded through Julian's chest. "I have several coats, Miss Whitfield. Freeing carriages is evidently not among my usual duties." "No," Elinor agreed, her smile widening slightly. "I imagine most dukes leave such tasks to their servants." "Most dukes," Julian said, "have not had the pleasure of your company on a rainy afternoon." They spoke for the better part of an hour, wandering slowly through the garden as other guests mingled and gossiped nearby, though Julian found he cared little for what anyone else observed or assumed about their conversation. Elinor spoke with the same directness he remembered from their first meeting, her opinions sharp and considered, her wit quick enough to keep him constantly engaged rather than merely entertained. She told him, eventually, of the pressure from her family, of Henry Colton's proposal, of the impossible choice between her own happiness and her family's financial survival. She spoke of it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, though Julian could hear the exhaustion beneath her composed tone. "And what do you wish, Elinor?" Julian asked quietly, as they paused near a quiet corner of the garden, away from the main gathering. "Setting aside your family's circumstances entirely, what would you choose if the choice were purely your own?" Elinor was quiet for a long moment, studying the roses beside them rather than meeting his eyes. "I would choose someone who wanted to know my thoughts, not merely tolerate them. Someone who found my opinions interesting rather than inconvenient. I suspect such a man does not exist, at least not for a woman in my circumstances, but if he did, that is what I would choose." Julian felt something shift powerfully in his chest at her words, an understanding settling over him with sudden, undeniable clarity. He was not certain, in that moment, what precisely he intended to do about the feeling growing steadily within him, but he knew with absolute certainty, that he was not prepared to simply watch Alina Whitfield disappear into a marriage that would slowly extinguish everything he found remarkable about her. "Such a man may exist," he said quietly, "though he may require some time to properly make himself known." Alina glanced up at him then, something uncertain and hopeful flickering across her expression before she carefully composed herself once more. "Your Grace, I would remind you that I have very little time remaining before decisions are made entirely without my input." "Then perhaps," Julian said, "it is time I stopped hesitating." Their conversation was interrupted before either could say more, as another guest approached to greet the Duke, and Alina was drawn away by her hostess toward a group of other young women. Julian watched her go, his mind now firmly made up, though he understood the path ahead would not be simple. There was Cassandra's ongoing cruelty to consider, the watchful eyes of society always ready to seize upon any hint of scandal, and his own family's expectations regarding an appropriate match for a duke of his standing. None of it mattered, he decided, standing alone in that garden as the afternoon light began to soften toward evening. He had spent years allowing his title to dictate every choice, every relationship, every careful, calculated decision about his future. For the first time since his father's death, Julian found himself wanting something purely for himself, without regard for what society expected or demanded. He wanted Alina Whitfield, not despite her sharp tongue and honest opinions, but entirely because of them. That evening, as Alina's carriage carried her home from the garden party, she found herself replaying every moment of her conversation with Julian, turning his words over carefully, searching for hidden meaning she both hoped and feared she had correctly understood. A duke, interested in her, a woman society had already declared unmarriageable, seemed too improbable to fully believe. Yet something in his expression, in the careful way he had spoken, in the promise implicit in his final words, had planted a seed of hope she had not felt in longer than she cared to admit. She knew better than to build her future on such uncertain foundations, knew that hope could prove as dangerous as despair when circumstances remained so precarious. Still that night, for the first time in weeks, Alina fell asleep with something resembling genuine hope rather than resigned dread, unaware of just how quickly the coming days would test both her hope and Julian's newfound resolve. News traveled quickly through London's fashionable circles, and it did not take long for whispers to begin regarding the Duke of Ashbourne's unusual attention toward Alina Whitfield at the garden party. Servants gossiped, guests speculated, and within days, the story had reached the one person who least wished to hear it. Lady Cassandra Pemberton sat in her drawing room, listening with mounting irritation as her closest friend, Miss Ophelia Barrington, recounted every detail of the encounter between Julian and Alina, embellishing the story with each retelling until it had grown into something resembling a full courtship rather than a single conversation at a garden party. "They spoke for nearly an hour," Ophelia said, sipping her tea with evident relish at delivering such delicious gossip. "Entirely alone in the far corner of the garden, and everyone remarked how the Duke seemed utterly captivated. Can you imagine, Cassandra, Alina Whitfield of all people?" Cassandra's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer as she set it down with more force than intended. "I am certain it means nothing. The Duke has always been notoriously difficult to read. He likely felt some obligation of politeness, nothing more." "Perhaps," Ophelia said, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe this explanation. "Though I did hear he specifically sought her out upon arrival, before speaking with anyone else present." Cassandra said nothing further on the matter, though inwardly, fury and something close to genuine alarm began to build within her. She had spent years cultivating her position as the most sought-after unmarried woman in London, had assumed, with the confident certainty of someone who had never truly been challenged, that the Duke of Ashbourne would eventually recognize her as the obvious choice for his Duchess. The thought that he might instead be drawn to Alina Whitfield, a woman she had publicly humiliated and dismissed as unmarriageable, struck at something far deeper than mere social rivalry. She decided, sitting alone after Ophelia had departed, that this situation required immediate and decisive action. Over the following days, Cassandra began carefully cultivating a new narrative, one designed to poison any budding connection between Julian and Alina before it could fully take root. She spoke, in carefully chosen whispers to carefully chosen ears, of Alina's unchaperoned meeting with a mysterious stranger on a country road weeks earlier, twisting the innocent circumstances of the muddy carriage rescue into something far more scandalous. "I understand she spent an entire afternoon alone with an unknown gentleman," Cassandra confided to another friend, careful to appear reluctant to share such damaging information. No chaperone, no witnesses beyond an elderly coachman who would say whatever his mistress instructed. One does wonder what precisely occurred during those hours. The rumor spread with the particular speed that scandal always seemed to travel through fashionable society, growing more elaborate and damaging with each retelling. By the time it reached Alina's own household, the story had transformed entirely, suggesting improprieties that had never actually occurred, painting her as a woman of questionable virtue rather than simply someone who had once helped free a stuck carriage wheel in the rain. Alina's mother arrived in her bedroom one morning, her face pale with distress, clutching a letter from a concerned family friend warning of the circulating gossip. "Tell me it is not true," her mother said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope that her daughter would deny everything. "Mother, I do not even know what specifically is being said," Alina replied, genuinely bewildered by her mother's distress. "They say you spent an afternoon alone with a strange man, unchaperoned, doing heaven knows what while your coachman waited nearby. They say your reputation is entirely ruined, that no respectable family would now consider you for their son." Alina felt cold dread settle in her stomach as she understood, finally, the source of such damaging rumors. "Mother, I promise you, nothing improper occurred. Our carriage became stuck in the mud during a storm, and a passing traveler stopped to help free the wheel. That is the entire truth of the matter." "The truth matters little once a story has spread through every drawing room in London," her mother said, sinking into a nearby chair with obvious exhaustion. "Whoever started this rumor has succeeded entirely in destroying whatever chance remained of you making a respectable match, beyond perhaps Henry Colton, who at least seems willing to overlook the scandal given his own family's need for a connection to more established society." Alina sat in stunned silence, understanding now the full weight of what had happened. Someone, likely Cassandra, though she could not prove it, had taken an innocent afternoon and twisted it into a weapon capable of destroying her already fragile reputation entirely. The unfairness of it burned through her, followed quickly by a deeper fear regarding what this meant for any possibility of a future with Julian. If society now believed her thoroughly compromised, what duke would ever consider her a suitable match, regardless of any genuine connection that might have begun to form between them? Across London, Julian received the news of the spreading rumors with considerably more anger than fear for his own reputation. He had spent the days since the garden party carefully considering how best to proceed, aware that any public courtship of Alina would require careful handling, given her family's precarious financial situation and the watchful judgment of society. He had not anticipated that someone would move to sabotage the situation before he had even properly begun. "This is Cassandra's doing," Louisa said flatly, when she brought him the news over breakfast, her expression grim with disapproval. "The story has grown considerably beyond what actually occurred, from what I understand. Everyone now believes Miss Whitfield engaged in some manner of impropriety during an unchaperoned meeting." "It was I who stopped to help with the carriage," Julian said, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "There was nothing improper in what occurred. We freed a stuck wheel together in the rain, nothing more." "I know that, brother, but the truth rarely matters once gossip has taken hold. What do you intend to do?" Julian sat in silence for a long moment, turning the question over carefully in his mind. His advisors, when he consulted them later that day, urged extreme caution, warning that any public association with a woman now embroiled in scandal could damage his own standing considerably, particularly given his responsibility to eventually secure an appropriate match and continue the family line. Perhaps it would be wisest, his steward Gareth Sinclair suggested carefully, to allow some distance to develop, Your Grace. Time has a way of quieting such rumors, particularly if no further connection is observed between yourself and Miss Whitfield. In perhaps a year, once the scandal has faded. A year, Julian repeated. In a year, Miss Whitfield will likely be married to a man who cares nothing for her thoughts or opinions, forced into that marriage entirely because of a rumor with no truth behind it whatsoever. That may be so, Your Grace, but your own position must be considered carefully. The dukedom's reputation. The dukedom's reputation has survived far worse than a false rumor about an innocent carriage repair, Julian said, his voice sharper than he intended. I will not abandon her simply because doing so would prove more convenient for my own standing. Gareth fell silent, though his expression made clear he did not entirely agree with his employer's reasoning. Julian dismissed him shortly afterward, needing solitude to properly consider his next course of action. He found Louisa waiting for him in the library that evening, her expression softer than it had been earlier, a quiet understanding present in her eyes that suggested she saw something in her brother that he himself had not yet fully articulated. You care for her, Louisa said simply, not quite a question. Julian considered denying it, considered offering some careful, measured response that would avoid revealing the full extent of his feelings even to his own sister. Instead, he found himself simply nodding, admitting a truth he had been reluctant to voice even to himself. She is the only person in London who has never once tried to please me, he said quietly. Everyone else calculates their every word, careful to flatter, to agree, to shape themselves into whatever they believe I wish them to be. Elinor simply speaks her mind, regardless of whether her opinions align with mine, regardless of my title. I did not realize how starved I was for that kind of honesty until I encountered it. Louisa smiled softly. Then you already know what you must do, Julian. You have simply been waiting for permission to do it, though I am not certain whose permission you believe you require. Julian considered his sister's words long after she had retired for the evening, sitting alone in the library with a glass of brandy he barely touched, watching the fire slowly burn down to embers. She was right, he realized. He had been waiting, hesitating, weighing consequences and considering propriety. When the answer had been clear from nearly the first moment, he saw Elinor Whitfield refuse to break beneath Cassandra's cruelty. He would not abandon her to protect his own reputation. He would not allow careful calculation to override the first genuine feeling he had experienced in years. The following morning, Julian sent a carefully worded letter to Elinor's father, requesting permission to call upon the family, making clear his intentions were entirely honorable, and that he wished to address the damaging rumors directly and publicly, in whatever manner would best restore Elinor's reputation. He did not yet know that events would move considerably faster than he anticipated, that within days, Elinor's family would make a desperate decision of their own, one that would force Julian's hand, and set in motion the dramatic night that would eventually silence every whisper and rumor that had ever been spoken against Elinor Whitfield. The letter from Julian arrived at the Whitfield household on a Tuesday morning, and Elinor's father read it 3 times before he fully believed what he was seeing. A duke, requesting permission to call upon the family, expressing clear and honorable intentions toward Elinor, at precisely the moment their reputation seemed most thoroughly ruined by circulating rumors. This changes everything, her father said, his voice trembling with a hope that had been entirely absent from their household for weeks. Elinor, if the Duke of Ashbourne courts you openly, publicly, it would silence every rumor instantly. No one would dare question your virtue if a duke himself vouches for your character. Elinor felt a complicated tangle of emotions at her father's words, relief and hope tangled together with something closer to unease. She wanted, desperately, to believe that Julian's intentions were genuine, born from real feeling rather than mere obligation or pity for her damaged reputation. Yet a small, cautious part of her worried that even a duke's attention might not prove strong enough to withstand the full weight of society's judgment, particularly once Cassandra Pemberton learned of this development and inevitably escalated her campaign of cruelty. "We must respond immediately," her father continued, already moving toward his writing desk. "Invite him to call this very week." "Father, please," Elinor said, needing a moment to gather her thoughts amid the sudden rush of her family's excitement. "I would prefer to consider this carefully before we proceed." "Consider what exactly? A duke wishes to court you, Elinor. This is precisely the miracle our family has been praying for." Elinor understood her father's relief, understood the desperate financial pressure that made Julian's letter feel like salvation, rather than simply a personal matter between two people who had shared a handful of meaningful conversations. Yet she could not entirely shake her worry that circumstances were moving too quickly, driven more by necessity and scandal than by the genuine, unhurried courtship she had always imagined for herself. Before she could fully voice these concerns, however, events took an unexpected and troubling turn. Word reached the Whitfield household 2 days later that Henry Colton, upon hearing rumors of the Duke's interest in Elinor, had grown suspicious and demanded immediate clarification regarding her availability for marriage, threatening to withdraw his own proposal entirely if he discovered any truth to the scandal surrounding the Country Road incident. Given that Henry's proposal represented the family's only secure financial solution, should the Duke's interest prove fleeting or ultimately unrealized, Elinor's father found himself caught between two impossible pressures. "We cannot afford to lose Henry's proposal on the mere possibility that the Duke's interest develops into something more permanent," he told Elinor that evening, his earlier excitement now tempered by renewed anxiety. "Yet we also cannot simply dismiss a Duke's genuine attention. I do not know what course of action best protects this family." It was Elinor's mother who finally proposed the solution that would set the coming crisis into motion. "Perhaps," she suggested carefully, "it would be wisest to send Elinor away temporarily to her aunt's estate in the countryside, until this scandal properly settles and we better understand the Duke's true intentions. Distance may prove protective, both for Elinor's reputation and for our negotiations with Mr. Colton." Elinor's father considered this suggestion for several long moments before nodding slowly. "It may indeed be wisest. A temporary absence would remove Elinor from the immediate scrutiny of London society, and by the time she returns, either the Duke will have made his intentions properly known, or the situation will have resolved itself in some other manner." Elinor listened to this discussion with growing alarm, understanding that her parents intended to send her away, effectively removing her from any possibility of a proper courtship with Julian, while they quietly negotiated with Henry Colton behind her back, hedging their family's fortunes against whichever suitor ultimately proved most reliable. "You cannot simply send me away as though I were a piece to be moved on a chess board," Elinor protested, though she already understood from painful experience how little control she truly held over decisions regarding her own future while her family's financial survival remained at stake. "Elinor, this is not a decision made lightly," her father said, his tone gentle but firm. "We must protect this family's interests, and until matters with the Duke are properly clarified, sending you to your aunt's estate seems the safest course available to us." The arrangements were made quickly, with Elinor scheduled to depart for the countryside within just 3 days' time, effectively removing her from London before Julian's promised visit could even take place. Elinor spent those days in a state of quiet desperation, uncertain how to communicate her family's decision to Julian, uncertain whether he would even learn of her departure before she had already gone, uncertain whether distance would truly protect her reputation, or simply ensure that whatever fragile connection had begun between them withered entirely from lack of contact. She wrote him a brief letter on the evening before her scheduled departure, explaining her family's decision as carefully and honestly as she could manage, though she tore up several drafts before finally settling on words that felt neither too forward nor too distant. She did not know whether the letter would even reach him before she left London, whether he might read it and simply conclude that pursuing her further had become too complicated, too burdened by scandal and family obligation to be worth continuing. She sealed the letter and gave it to a trusted servant to deliver the following morning, then spent a restless, sleepless night staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she shared with Charlotte, wondering whether she had just witnessed the quiet ending of something that had barely begun. Julian, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware of these developments, having spent the past days carefully preparing for his promised visit to the Whitfield household, consulting with his sister regarding the most appropriate manner of publicly declaring his intentions in a way that would properly silence the damaging rumors circulating through society. He had begun drafting a statement he intended to make publicly at the next significant social gathering, formally acknowledging his interest in courting Alina and firmly denying any impropriety regarding their initial meeting on the country road. He received Alina's letter on the very morning of her scheduled departure, delivered by a breathless servant who explained that Miss Whitfield had specifically requested it reach him as quickly as possible. Julian read the letter twice, his expression growing increasingly troubled with each line, understanding immediately the desperate circumstances that had led her family to such a decision. "They intend to send her away," he told Louisa, finding her in the drawing room shortly after reading the letter. "Today. To remove her from London while they quietly continue negotiations with Henry Colton, hedging against the possibility that my own interest proves insufficient to overcome their financial desperation." "Then you must act quickly," Louisa said, her expression sharp with sudden urgency. "If she departs today, how long before she reaches her aunt's estate?" "Several hours' journey, according to her letter. If I leave immediately, I may catch her carriage before it departs, or failing that, follow directly to her aunt's estate." "Julian," Louisa said carefully, "consider what such an action would mean. Pursuing her openly, publicly, chasing after her carriage like something from a novel, it would end any possibility of quiet resolution. Society would speak of nothing else for months." "Then let them speak," Julian said, already moving toward the door, his earlier caution and careful calculation entirely abandoned in favor of a decisiveness that surprised even himself. "I have spent years allowing careful calculation to dictate every decision of my life, weighing consequences, considering propriety, protecting a reputation that has brought me very little genuine happiness. I will not allow that same caution to cost me the one person who has ever made me feel like myself, rather than merely a title to be managed." Louisa smiled, though her eyes remained serious. "Then go, brother. Whatever happens, I believe you are finally making the right choice." Julian called for his fastest horse rather than a carriage, reasoning correctly that speed would prove more valuable than comfort given the urgency of the situation. He rode toward the Whitfield household with a determination that bordered on desperation, praying he might arrive before Alina's carriage departed, that he might have the chance to properly declare his intentions before her family's fear and financial desperation carried her permanently beyond his reach. He arrived at the Whitfield townhouse to find it in a state of quiet confusion, servants moving trunks toward a waiting carriage, while Alina's mother directed the preparations with visible anxiety. Julian dismounted quickly, his heart sinking as he realized he might already be too late. "Your Grace," Alina's mother said, startled by his sudden, unexpected arrival, her expression shifting rapidly from surprise to careful calculation as she recognized the significance of a duke arriving unannounced at their door. "We did not expect." "Where is Alina?" Julian asked, his usual careful composure entirely abandoned. "I understand she is departing today." "She has already left, Your Grace. Her carriage departed not an hour ago, bound for her aunt's estate in Surrey." Julian felt something close to panic rise in his chest, quickly followed by fierce, unwavering resolve. "Then I will follow." "Your Grace, surely such a journey can wait until—" "It cannot wait," Julian said firmly. "I intend to speak with your daughter today, Mrs. Whitfield, and I intend to do so before this family makes any further arrangements regarding her future without her genuine, freely given consent." Without waiting for further response, Julian remounted his horse and set off towards Surrey, understanding that the journey would take several hours, that darkness would likely fall long before he reached his destination, that the coming ride would test both his horse's endurance and his own resolve in ways he had never before experienced. Yet none of these considerations slowed his pace as he rode out of London, the city's familiar streets giving way gradually to open countryside, the afternoon light beginning its slow, inevitable slide toward evening. He did not yet know precisely what he would say when he finally reached Elinor, did not know whether her aunt's household would even permit an unmarried duke to call upon their guest at such an unusual hour, did not know whether Elinor herself would welcome such a dramatic, unconventional gesture, or view it as yet another complication in an already difficult situation. He knew only that he could not simply allow her to disappear from his life, without at least attempting to properly declare what had grown, over these past weeks, into something he could no longer deny or dismiss as mere passing interest. Whatever the consequences, whatever society might eventually say about a duke chasing across county lines after a woman already tangled in scandal, Julian understood, with absolute clarity, that remaining silent would prove a far greater regret than any risk the coming journey might carry. The rain began again as evening fell, turning the road beneath his horse's hooves treacherous and slick, though Julian did not slow his pace, driven forward by an urgency that made the physical discomfort of the journey feel entirely insignificant compared to what awaited, or failed to await him, at its end. Elinor's carriage reached her aunt's estate just as the afternoon light began fading into evening, and she stepped down from it feeling utterly drained, the weight of leaving London, of leaving whatever possibility had existed with Julian, pressing heavily upon her despite the countryside's quiet, welcoming beauty. Her aunt, a widowed woman named Margaret Ashford who had always shown Elinor particular warmth and understanding, greeted her with open arms and immediate concern. "You look exhausted, my dear," her aunt said, ushering her inside the modest but comfortable manor house. "Your mother's letter mentioned some difficulty in London, though she was frustratingly vague regarding the particulars." "It is a long story, Aunt Margaret," Elinor said, allowing herself to be led toward the drawing room, grateful for her aunt's gentle, unhurried manner after weeks of anxious pressure from her own parents. "Well, we have time enough for long stories," her aunt replied, settling into a chair near the fireplace and gesturing for Elinor to do the same. "Tell me everything, and do not spare the details simply because you fear they might trouble me. I have weathered worse scandals than whatever London currently whispers about you." Elinor found herself relaxing slightly in her aunt's presence, the familiar comfort of childhood visits returning gradually as she began recounting the events of the past weeks, Cassandra's public humiliation, the chance encounter with Julian on the muddy road, the garden party where his true identity had finally been revealed, and finally, the damaging rumors that had prompted her parents' decision to send her away. "A duke," her aunt said thoughtfully, once Elinor had finished her account, "and you believe his interest is genuine rather than merely a passing curiosity or misplaced sense of chivalry." "I do not know what to believe any longer," Elinor admitted. "Everything has happened so quickly, and my parents seem more concerned with securing our family's financial future than with understanding what I actually feel or wish for myself. That is often the way of things, unfortunately, when a family's survival depends upon advantageous marriage," her aunt said gently. "Though I would ask you this, Elinor, setting aside every practical consideration, every worry about scandal or financial necessity, what do you feel when you think of this duke of yours?" Elinor considered the question carefully, staring into the fire as she searched for an honest answer. "I feel as though, for the first time, someone sees me clearly, rather than seeing only what they wish me to be. When I am with him, I do not feel the need to soften my opinions or pretend to agree with things I do not believe. He asked me once what I would choose, if the choice were purely my own, and I could not properly answer, because I had never before been asked such a question by anyone who seemed to genuinely wish to know. Her aunt smiled softly. Then perhaps, my dear, you already know your answer, whatever your parents' practical concerns might suggest. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the sudden sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway, followed by a servant appearing at the drawing-room door, her expression a mixture of confusion and excitement. "Begging your pardon, madam," the servant said, addressing Aliner's aunt, "but there is a gentleman at the door, quite insistent upon speaking with Miss Whitfield immediately. He says his name is Julian Hartley, and he claims to be—" "The Duke of Ashbourne," Aliner finished, rising so quickly from her chair that she nearly upset the small table beside it, her heart suddenly pounding with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming hope. Her aunt raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by this dramatic development. "Well, it seems your Duke has followed you rather further than propriety typically allows. Shall we discover what has brought him to my door at such an unusual hour, soaked through, I imagine, given how the weather has turned this evening?" Aliner followed her aunt toward the entrance hall, her mind racing with 1,000 questions and an equal measure of disbelief that Julian had actually followed her, had ridden all this way, presumably through the very rain now audible against the windows, simply to speak with her. She found him standing in the entrance hall, exactly as she had imagined, his clothes soaked through and mud-splattered from what must have been a long, difficult ride, his hair plastered against his forehead, his expression a raw combination of exhaustion and fierce, unwavering determination. He looked in that moment nothing like the composed, careful Duke society knew, and everything like the man she had first met on a muddy country road, rescuing a stranger's carriage without any concern for his own comfort or appearance. "Julian," Aliner breathed, momentarily forgetting propriety entirely as she took in the sight of him, understanding instinctively that he had ridden through the storm, through hours of difficult travel, purely for the chance to see her. "Aliner," Julian said, his voice rough with exhaustion though his eyes remained fixed on her with unwavering intensity, "I apologize for the hour and for my appearance. I received your letter this morning, and understood immediately that I could not simply allow you to disappear from London without properly telling you what I should have said days ago." Aliner's aunt, understanding the significance of the moment unfolding before her, quietly excused herself and the servant, leaving the entrance hall to the two of them, though she remained close enough, Aliner suspected, to ensure propriety was maintained even in these highly unusual circumstances. "You rode all this way," Aliner said, still struggling to fully believe what she was witnessing. "Through the storm, simply to speak with me." "I would have ridden considerably further," Julian said, taking a step closer, though he stopped himself, seeming to recall, even in his exhaustion, the proper distance expected between them. "Aliner, I understand your family's circumstances, understand the pressure you face regarding Henry Colton's proposal, understand that my sudden appearance here likely complicates matters considerably rather than simplifying them. But I could not allow you to leave London believing that my interest in you was anything less than entirely genuine, entirely serious, and entirely unrelated to any concern for scandal or reputation." "What are you saying, Julian?" Aliner asked, though something in her chest had already begun to understand, had already begun to hope for words she scarcely dared believe he might actually speak. "I am saying," Julian continued, his voice steadying despite his obvious exhaustion, "that from the very first moment I saw you standing in that ballroom, refusing to break beneath Cassandra Pemberton's cruelty, I could not stop thinking of you. That our afternoon in the rain, freeing a carriage wheel together, remains among the most genuinely happy memories I possess from these past several years. That every conversation we have shared since has only deepened my certainty that you are unlike anyone else I have ever known, and that I do not wish to spend another single day pretending otherwise, regardless of what society might say, regardless of scandal, regardless of the careful calculations my position typically demands." Aliner felt tears gathering in her eyes, though they were tears of overwhelming relief and joy rather than sadness. "Julian, My family's circumstances remain unchanged. The debts, the pressure, Henry Colton's proposal. None of that has disappeared simply because you have ridden through a storm to find me. I am aware of that, Julian said, and I intend to address every one of those concerns properly, publicly, and without further delay. But before I do so, I needed you to hear these words directly from me, without the complication of my title or my position clouding whatever answer you might choose to give. Eleanor Whitfield, I do not simply wish to court you as a matter of convenience or obligation. I wish to know you fully, to hear every honest opinion you possess, to build a life together in which your voice is never something to be tolerated or silenced, but something genuinely treasured. If you will permit me, I intend to make my intentions known to all of London, beginning with your family's immediate financial concerns, which I am more than capable of addressing directly. Eleanor stared at him, scarcely able to process the full weight of what he was offering, not merely courtship, but genuine partnership, genuine understanding, and a solution to her family's desperate financial circumstances that would remove the terrible burden that had weighed upon her for weeks. "Julian," she said finally, her voice steady despite the overwhelming emotion coursing through her, "I would be honored to accept your courtship, though I must ask, are you certain this is truly what you wish, and not simply a rescue offered from misplaced chivalry or guilt regarding the rumors that have damaged my reputation?" "I have never in my life been more certain of anything," Julian said firmly. "This is not rescue, Eleanor. This is choice freely made, born from genuine feeling that has only grown stronger with every moment I have spent in your company. I choose you, not despite the circumstances society finds so scandalous, but entirely regardless of them." Eleanor's aunt, apparently having listened from a discreet distance, chose that moment to reappear, her expression carefully composed though clearly delighted by what she had overheard. "Well," she said, "it seems this evening has proven rather more eventful than I anticipated. Your Grace, I insist you remain here tonight rather than attempting the return journey to London in this weather. We shall properly discuss matters of propriety and family circumstances once you have both had opportunity to dry off and rest, and once I have sent word to Eleanor's parents regarding this rather remarkable development." Julian nodded gratefully, finally allowing himself to acknowledge the sheer physical exhaustion of the journey now that his purpose had been accomplished. "Thank you, madam. I am deeply grateful for your hospitality, and I promise to conduct myself with every propriety your household requires." As Eleanor's aunt moved to arrange proper accommodations and send word to London, Eleanor remained standing in the entrance hall with Julian, both of them still slightly stunned by the events that had just unfolded, by the promises exchanged, by the future that suddenly seemed possible, where only hours earlier despair had seemed the only certainty. "I still cannot quite believe you rode all this way," Eleanor said softly, allowing herself finally to smile fully, without reservation or caution. "Believe it," Julian said, matching her smile despite his exhaustion. "And believe this as well, Eleanor, whatever challenges remain ahead of us, whatever scandal or family pressure we must still navigate, I do not intend to let anything separate us again. Not distance, not rumor, not even the most stubborn financial circumstances your family's situation presents." Eleanor felt, standing there in her aunt's entrance hall with rain still falling steadily outside and Julian's mud-splattered, exhausted figure before her, that she had never in her life felt more genuinely hopeful about the future, more certain that perhaps, despite every obstacle society had placed before her, she had finally found someone who saw her exactly as she was and wanted her precisely because of it, rather than in spite of it. Neither of them yet knew that the coming days would require considerably more than simple declarations of feeling, that Cassandra Pemberton's jealousy would not simply fade away now that her rival's fortune had shifted, and that a final, public confrontation awaited them both before their story could reach its proper, well-earned conclusion. But for that night at least, sheltered from the storm within her aunt's warm and welcoming home, Eleanor allowed herself simply to feel the overwhelming relief and joy of finally being chosen, fully and completely, by someone worthy of her trust. Julian's dramatic overnight ride to Surrey reached London within 2 days, spreading through fashionable society with the same remarkable speed that had once carried Cassandra's damaging rumors about Alina's supposed impropriety. This time, however, the story worked entirely in Alina's favor, transforming her from a woman whispered about with scorn into someone whose circumstances had apparently captured the genuine devotion of one of London's most eligible and previously unattainable dukes. Alina's parents received word of Julian's declaration and subsequent intentions with a relief so profound that her father reportedly wept openly upon reading his wife's letter describing the events at her sister's estate. The desperate financial pressure that had driven them toward Henry Colton's proposal evaporated almost entirely once Julian, true to his word, arranged a private meeting with Alina's father to discuss both his intentions toward Alina and practical assistance in addressing the family's outstanding debts. "I do not offer this assistance as payment for your daughter's hand," Julian explained carefully during that meeting, wanting to ensure there was no misunderstanding regarding his motivations. "Alina has made clear she wishes to be valued for herself, not treated as a transaction to be negotiated. I offer this help simply because I intend to become part of this family, and families support one another through difficulty." Alina's father, understanding the genuine respect underlying Julian's careful words, accepted the offer with profound gratitude, and within days, arrangements were made to settle the family's most pressing debts, removing the desperate urgency that had made Henry Colton's proposal feel like their only viable option. Henry himself, upon learning of the Duke's clear intentions toward Alina, gracefully withdrew his own proposal, admitting privately to a mutual acquaintance that he had never truly expected to compete with such devoted attention. Alina returned to London a week after Julian's dramatic arrival at her aunt's estate, and the difference in how society now regarded her proved almost dizzying compared to the scorn she had faced only weeks earlier. Invitations arrived at the Whitfield household with unprecedented frequency. Families who had previously ignored their existence suddenly eager to claim acquaintance, and even those who had participated most enthusiastically in spreading Cassandra's damaging rumors now seemed eager to distance themselves from any association with such clearly mistaken gossip. Alina found this sudden reversal deeply unsettling rather than satisfying. "It seems," she remarked to Julian during one of their now regular walks through a public garden, properly chaperoned by Charlotte, "that my worth has changed entirely in society's eyes, not because I have changed in any meaningful way, but simply because you have chosen to associate with me." "Society's judgment has always been fickle and frequently wrong," Julian agreed, understanding her frustration completely. "It does not trouble me particularly what fair-weather opinions now circulate, so long as you understand that my own regard for you has never wavered based on anyone else's approval or disapproval." "I do understand that," Alina said, "though it does not entirely ease my anger at how easily people abandon their cruel judgments the moment convenience demands it. Cassandra spread those rumors deliberately, knowing full well they were exaggerated beyond recognition, and yet I suspect she will face no genuine consequence for the damage she caused." Julian's expression grew thoughtful at this observation. "Perhaps that particular matter deserves more direct attention than we have thus far given it." Alina glanced at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Julian said, "that I have been considering how best to properly and publicly address the falsehoods that were spread about you, in a manner that ensures everyone understands precisely what occurred, and precisely who bears responsibility for the cruelty and dishonesty that nearly cost you a chance at genuine happiness." Their opportunity arrived sooner than either expected, when Louisa informed them of an upcoming ball hosted by the same family whose garden party had first revealed Julian's true identity to Alina. The event promised to draw much of fashionable London, including, Louisa confirmed with some distaste, Lady Cassandra Pemberton herself. "It seems an appropriate setting," Julian said, once Louisa had shared this information, For setting matters properly straight, should you feel prepared for such a public moment, Alina? Alina considered the suggestion carefully. She had no particular desire for confrontation or public spectacle, having already endured more than enough humiliation within London's ballrooms to last a lifetime. Yet something in her also recognized the value of finally, publicly reclaiming the narrative that Cassandra had so deliberately twisted against her. "I believe I am prepared," Alina said finally, "though I would ask that whatever we say be done with dignity, rather than descending to the same cruelty that was shown toward me. I do not wish to become the very thing I have spent these past months resenting." "A wise approach," Julian agreed, "and one I fully support. We shall simply ensure the truth is properly known, without unnecessary cruelty toward anyone, including Lady Cassandra." In the days leading up to the ball, Alina found herself experiencing a complex mixture of anticipation and lingering anxiety. Though Julian's devotion had transformed her circumstances entirely, some part of her still carried the memory of that earlier humiliation, still flinched slightly at the thought of stepping into a crowded ballroom where she had once been so thoroughly mocked. Charlotte, sensing her sister's quiet worry, sat with her the evening before the ball, helping arrange her hair and offering the particular comfort that only a devoted sibling could provide. "You are not the same woman who stood in that ballroom months ago," Charlotte said gently, meeting Alina's eyes in the mirror before them. "You have survived scandal, earned the genuine devotion of a man worthy of you, and secured our family's future through your own strength and honesty, not through pretending to be someone you are not. Whatever happens tomorrow evening, remember that truth." Alina squeezed her sister's hand gratefully, feeling steadied by her words. "Thank you, Charlotte. I do not know what I would do without your constant faith in me." "You would manage perfectly well," Charlotte said with a small smile, "though I am glad you do not have to find out." The evening of the ball arrived with a clear sky and mild weather, quite unlike the storms that had marked so many pivotal moments of Alina's recent experience. She dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep blue that Julian had gifted her for the occasion, simple in design but exquisitely made. A reflection, she thought, of exactly how she wished to present herself, genuine and unadorned by excessive ornamentation, yet unmistakably elegant. Julian arrived to escort her personally, and Alina felt her earlier anxiety ease somewhat at the sight of him, dressed formally, yet somehow still carrying that same quiet steadiness she had first noticed on the muddy country road months earlier. "You look remarkable," Julian said softly, offering his arm as they prepared to depart for the ball. "I feel remarkably nervous," Alina admitted honestly. "That is entirely understandable," Julian said, "though I promise you whatever unfolds tonight you will not face it alone." The carriage ride to the ball passed largely in comfortable silence, Alina gathering her composure while Julian remained a steady, reassuring presence beside her. When they finally arrived and made their way into the brightly lit ballroom, Alina felt every eye in the room turned toward them, the whispers beginning almost instantly, though this time, she noted with some satisfaction, the whispers carried curiosity and admiration, rather than the cruel mockery she remembered from her previous experience in this exact setting. Cassandra Pemberton stood near the center of the room, surrounded by her usual circle of admirers, and Alina watched her expression shift through surprise, calculation, and finally something resembling forced composure as she took in the sight of Alina entering the ballroom on the Duke of Ashbourne's arm. "Steady yourself," Julian murmured quietly, sensing Alina's tension as they moved further into the room. "Whatever happens next, remember you have already won every part of this contest that genuinely matters." Alina nodded, drawing strength from his quiet confidence, understanding that the coming confrontation, however it unfolded, would not determine her worth or her future happiness. Those things had already been decided, weeks earlier, on a muddy road where a stranger had stopped to help a struggling carriage without any knowledge of who she was or what society thought of her. As the evening progressed and the moment for confrontation approached, Alina felt her earlier anxiety gradually transform into something steadier, something closer to genuine readiness. as she prepared to finally, publicly reclaim the narrative that had been so unfairly twisted against her, standing not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a woman who had weathered genuine hardship and emerged, ultimately, stronger and more certain of her own worth than she had ever been before. The moment arrived during a brief pause in the dancing, when Julian, with the natural authority that came from years of commanding respect as a duke, requested a few minutes of the assembled guests' attention. His request quickly honored given his standing among those present. Alina stood beside him, her hand steady in his, as the music faded and conversation gradually quieted throughout the ballroom. "I apologize for interrupting this delightful evening," Julian began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed room. "But I find myself compelled to address certain matters that have caused considerable and entirely unwarranted harm to someone I hold in the highest regard." Alina felt every eye in the room turned toward her, though this time, standing beside Julian with her chin lifted and her composure steady, she found she could meet those gazes without the crushing shame that had overwhelmed her during her previous humiliation in this very room. "Some months ago," Julian continued, "Miss Alina Whitfield was subjected to public cruelty in this very ballroom, mocked and declared unmarriageable by someone who, I understand, considered such judgment entirely her right to pronounce. Since that evening, further false rumors have circulated, suggesting impropriety regarding an entirely innocent encounter between Miss Whitfield and myself, when her carriage became stuck during a storm and I, as any decent person would, stopped to assist." A murmur ran through the assembled guests, and Alina watched with some satisfaction as Cassandra's face grew increasingly pale, her earlier composed smile faltering entirely. "I wish to state, clearly and without any ambiguity," Julian continued, "that nothing improper occurred during that encounter, that Miss Whitfield's character has been entirely and unfairly maligned by rumors with no basis in truth, and that I have since come to know her as a woman of remarkable intelligence, honesty, and strength of character, qualities that were mocked rather than valued when they should have been celebrated." He paused, glancing down at Alina with a warmth that softened the formal cadence of his public declaration. "It is my great honor to announce my intention to court Miss Whitfield openly and properly, with the full approval of her family, and I trust that anyone who has spread falsehoods about her character will now understand the harm such careless cruelty can cause, and will conduct themselves with greater consideration in the future." The ballroom erupted into a flurry of whispered conversation, though this time the whispers carried admiration rather than mockery, several guests offering approving nods toward Alina, others already beginning to reconsider their earlier willingness to believe such damaging gossip. Cassandra, understanding that her earlier cruelty had just been publicly and thoroughly exposed before the very society whose opinion she valued above all else, attempted a hasty recovery. "I am certain no harm was intended," she said, her voice noticeably less confident than her usual carefully cultivated tone. "Rumors do have a way of growing beyond their original truth, entirely without anyone's deliberate intention." Alina, drawing on the composure and dignity she had cultivated through months of hardship, stepped forward slightly, choosing her words with the same careful honesty that had defined her throughout this entire ordeal. "Lady Cassandra, I bear no lasting resentment toward you, though I would ask that in the future you consider the genuine harm careless words can cause before speaking them so freely. I have learned, through recent difficult months, that a person's worth is not determined by whether society finds them fashionable or convenient to admire, but by the honesty and integrity with which they conduct themselves, regardless of who happens to be watching." The room fell silent for a moment at Alina's measured, dignified response, before scattered applause began, growing steadily, until much of the assembled crowd had joined in genuine appreciation for the grace with which Alina had handled a moment that could easily have descended into bitter confrontation instead. Cassandra, recognizing that any further attempt at defense would only deepen her own public embarrassment, offered a stiff curtsy, and quickly retreated toward the edge of the ballroom, her circle of admirers noticeably thinner as several of her previous companions chose, instead to approach Alina with newly warm congratulations and apologies for having believed such obviously exaggerated rumors. As the music resumed and normal conversation gradually returned to the ballroom, Julian led Alina toward a quieter corner, away from the immediate press of well-wishers eager to offer their belated approval. "How do you feel?" Julian asked softly, studying her expression carefully. Alina considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. "Lighter," she said finally. "As though I have finally set down a weight I did not fully realize I was carrying. I do not need Cassandra's apology or society's approval to know my own worth, but I confess it feels genuinely good to have the truth properly acknowledged, rather than simply enduring false rumors in silence." "You never should have had to endure any of it silently," Julian said, his expression serious. "I only wish I had spoken sooner, before the rumors had opportunity to spread so widely." "You spoke exactly when it mattered most," Alina said, reaching to gently touch his arm. "You rode through a storm for me, Julian. Whatever came before that night matters far less than the fact that when it counted most, you chose honesty and courage over caution and convenient silence." They remained together for the rest of the evening, dancing when the music called for it, speaking quietly during the pauses between, and Alina found herself, for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, entirely at ease within a crowded ballroom, no longer bracing herself against cruelty or judgment, but simply enjoying the genuine warmth of celebration and vindication that surrounded her. In the weeks that followed, Julian's courtship of Alina proceeded with the same open honesty that had characterized their relationship from its very beginning. He called upon her regularly, always properly chaperoned, and their conversations continued to range across every topic imaginable, from literature and philosophy to practical matters of estate management, Alina's sharp intelligence and honest opinions proving, exactly as Julian had promised, a source of genuine delight rather than inconvenience. Her family's financial circumstances, secured through Julian's generous and carefully arranged assistance, gradually stabilized, allowing her parents to breathe freely for the first time in years without the constant looming threat of financial ruin. Charlotte, watching her sister's transformation from despair to genuine happiness, found her own hope for the future considerably brightened, understanding now that even the most difficult circumstances could sometimes give way to unexpected joy. Several months after that pivotal ball, Julian formally proposed to Alina during a quiet walk through the very garden where he had first revealed his true identity to her, choosing that meaningful location deliberately, wanting the moment to properly honor the journey that had brought them together. "Alina Whitfield," he said, kneeling before her with a small velvet box in hand, "you have taught me more about honesty, courage, and genuine partnership than I ever expected to learn in this lifetime. I do not offer you simply a title or a comfortable future, though I hope to provide both. I offer you a partner who will always value your voice, who will never wish you to be smaller or quieter or more agreeable than your true nature demands, and who considers himself fortunate beyond measure that a stuck carriage wheel on a rainy afternoon brought us together. Will you marry me?" Alina, her eyes bright with happy tears, did not hesitate in her answer. "Yes, Julian. 1,000 times yes." Their wedding, held some months later, drew guests from across London society, including, somewhat to Alina's private amusement, Lady Cassandra Pemberton herself, who had apparently learned enough humility from her earlier public embarrassment to offer genuine, if somewhat subdued, congratulations. Alina accepted the gesture graciously, understanding that true contentment required no further victory over someone who had once sought to diminish her, that her own happiness stood entirely secure regardless of anyone else's opinion. As Alina stood beside Julian on their wedding day, surrounded by family and friends who had watched their remarkable journey unfold from public humiliation to genuine, hard-won love, she found herself reflecting on the words that had once been spoken so cruelly against her in that very ballroom where their story had, in many ways, truly begun. "No gentleman will ever want you," Cassandra had declared, certain in her cruelty that such words carried absolute truth. Yet here stood Alinar, chosen not by just any gentleman, but by a duke who had traveled through storm and darkness, who had risked his own reputation and standing, who had ridden through an entire night simply for the chance to properly tell her what she had, until that moment, scarcely dared hope might be true. She had not needed rescue, not truly. She had needed only someone willing to see her clearly, to value her honesty rather than fear it, to choose her not despite her sharp opinions and unwillingness to soften herself for society's comfort, but entirely because of those very qualities. In Julian, she had found exactly that, and in finding him, she had also finally found the unshakable confidence to know her own worth, regardless of whatever cruel words society might occasionally still choose to speak. Their story, whispered afterward through London's drawing rooms for years to come, became something of a legend among those who had witnessed its remarkable unfolding. Proof, many would say, that genuine character eventually finds its proper recognition, that cruelty rarely triumphs over quiet dignity and honest strength, and that sometimes, against every reasonable expectation, a duke really will travel through the darkest storm for exactly the right woman. 2 years into their marriage, Alinar and Julian traveled together to inspect one of the more distant estates belonging to the dukedom, a sprawling property in the north that Julian had visited rarely since childhood. The journey gave Alinar her first proper look at the full scope of responsibilities that came with her husband's title, responsibilities she had begun sharing more directly than most duchesses of her acquaintance, much to the quiet disapproval of some traditional members of society who still occasionally muttered that a duchess ought to concern herself with household matters rather than estate accounts and tenant welfare. Alinar had long since stopped caring what such critics thought. Upon arriving at the northern estate, they discovered the local steward, a man named Frederick Lowry, had been mismanaging tenant affairs for years, collecting rents unfairly and neglecting essential repairs to cottages that housed families who had worked the land for generations. Where a previous duchess might have deferred entirely to her husband's judgment in such matters, Alinar insisted on personally reviewing the accounts and speaking directly with several tenant families, uncovering discrepancies that Julian's usual advisors, distracted by matters in London, had entirely overlooked. "You have found in a single afternoon what my previous stewards failed to notice across several years," Julian remarked, genuinely impressed as Alinar laid out her findings that evening, ledgers spread across the study table between them. "I simply asked questions and listened to honest answers," Alinar said, though she could not fully hide her satisfaction at having contributed something so meaningfully useful. "It is remarkable how much people will tell you, once they believe someone is genuinely willing to listen." Frederick Lowry was dismissed within the week, replaced by a younger, more conscientious steward Alinar herself recommended after making careful inquiries among the local community. And the tenant families, whose cottages had been neglected, finally saw the repairs they had long been promised. Word of the young duchess's direct involvement in correcting such injustice spread quickly through the northern countryside, earning Alinar a reputation for fairness and genuine care that would follow her for the rest of her life, quite separate from whatever lingering gossip occasionally still circulated in London's more judgmental circles. Their return to London later that season coincided with Charlotte's own debut into society, and Alinar found herself watching her younger sister navigate the same treacherous social waters she herself had once struggled through, though this time with the considerable advantage of a duchess for a sister, ensuring that Charlotte would never face the same cruel isolation Alinar had once endured. "Promise me something," Alinar told Charlotte, helping her prepare for her very first significant ball, much as their mother had once helped prepare Alinar for her own disastrous evening years earlier. "Promise me you will never allow anyone's cruel words to convince you that your honest opinions make you less worthy of genuine love." Charlotte smiled, squeezing her sister's hand. "I have watched you prove that lesson true with my own eyes, Alinar. I do not think I could forget it now, even if I wished to." Charlotte's own path through society proved considerably smoother than Alinar's had been. partly due to genuine changes in how certain families now regarded outspoken women following Alina's very public vindication, and partly due to Charlotte's own naturally warmer, more diplomatic temperament, which allowed her to express herself honestly without generating quite the same friction Alina's sharper wit had occasionally caused. Within 2 seasons, Charlotte had found genuine affection with a thoughtful young barrister named Thomas Ellery, a match built on mutual respect that pleased both Alina and their parents considerably. Meanwhile, Alina and Julian's own marriage continued to deepen in ways that surprised even Julian's more skeptical advisors, who had initially worried that a duchess with such firm opinions might prove difficult to manage within the traditional expectations of noble society. Instead, Alina's involvement in estate matters, her genuine care for tenant welfare, and her willingness to speak plainly even in situations where flattery might have proven more comfortable, gradually earned her widespread respect rather than the ongoing scorn some had initially predicted. Gareth Sinclair, Julian's longtime steward who had once cautioned against pursuing Alina given the scandal surrounding her name, eventually became one of her most vocal admirers, privately confessing to Louisa that he had rarely encountered anyone with such a natural talent for balancing compassion with practical judgment. "I confess I doubted the Duke's decision when this all began," Gareth admitted to Louisa one afternoon, watching Alina across the estate gardens as she discussed crop rotation with visiting tenant farmers, entirely comfortable in a role many duchesses would have considered beneath their dignity. "I worried that scandal would follow the family regardless of the truth behind it, that a woman so willing to speak her mind might prove difficult within the careful expectations of noble society." "And now," Louisa asked, though she already suspected his answer. "Now I believe my brother made the finest decision of his life," Gareth said. "Whatever difficulties her honesty occasionally creates within stuffy drawing rooms, it has brought genuine benefit to every tenant, every servant, and every person fortunate enough to fall within her care." Louisa smiled, watching her sister-in-law with genuine affection. "That has always been Alina's particular gift, Gareth. She simply refuses to pretend, even when pretending would prove considerably more convenient." As the years passed, Alina and Julian's story became something of a quiet legend within certain circles of London society, retold not with the cruel mockery that had once characterized whispers about Alina's supposed unmarriageability, but with genuine admiration for a partnership built on honesty rather than mere convenient arrangement. Young women entering society for the first time occasionally sought Alina's counsel, hoping to learn how she had navigated such treacherous social waters while remaining entirely true to herself. And Alina found genuine satisfaction in offering the same advice her aunt had once given her. "Do not measure your worth by how easily you please a room full of strangers," she would tell them. "Measure it instead by whether you remain true to your own honest character, regardless of who happens to be watching. The right people, when they finally arrive in your life, will value that honesty far more than any careful, calculated performance you might otherwise offer." Lady Cassandra Pemberton, meanwhile, eventually married a viscount of modest fortune, a match that some in society whispered represented something of a disappointment compared to the grand ambitions she had once nursed toward securing a duke for herself. Alina, upon hearing this news, felt no particular satisfaction in her former rival's more modest circumstances, having genuinely moved past whatever resentment she had once carried. She occasionally encountered Cassandra at various social gatherings over the following years, and while their relationship never grew warm, both women maintained a polite, distant civility that suited them both far better than open hostility ever could have. On a quiet evening several years into their marriage, Alina and Julian sat together in the same London townhouse where their courtship had first properly begun, Alina now expecting their first child, her hand resting contentedly over the gentle curve of her growing belly, while Julian read aloud from a book of poetry she had recently discovered and insisted he share with her. "Do you ever think of that afternoon on the muddy road?" Alina asked, interrupting his reading with the question that had drifted, unbidden, into her thoughts. Julian set down the book, his expression softening with fond memory. "Constantly," he admitted. "I think of how close I came to simply riding past, to leaving you and your coachman to solve the problem alone, as propriety and caution might have suggested. I think of how differently our lives might have unfolded had I made that choice instead." "I am glad you did not," Elinor said softly. "As am I," Julian replied, reaching to take her hand in his own. "More grateful, in fact, than I have ever properly managed to express, though I intend to spend the rest of our lives together attempting exactly that." Elinor smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the fire crackled quietly in the hearth beside them. The storm of scandal and cruelty that had once threatened to define her entirely, now nothing more than a distant, nearly forgotten memory, replaced instead by the quiet, steady contentment of a life built on genuine honesty, mutual respect, and love that had proven, in the end, considerably stronger than any cruel words spoken against her in a crowded, judgmental ballroom so many years before. Their daughter was born that winter, a healthy, spirited girl they named Rose, who would grow, in the years that followed, to inherit her mother's sharp intelligence and her father's quiet steadiness. A fitting combination for a child born from a love story that had begun, so improbably, with a stuck carriage wheel and a rainstorm that neither Elinor nor Julian had ever properly stopped being grateful for.